The night I was 12, my mother looked at me like I was a mistake she could finally correct. I remember the kitchen light buzzing overhead, the clock ticking so loudly it felt like it was counting down to something I didn't understand yet. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just said, "You're leaving tonight." My hands froze around a small backpack she had already packed for me. I asked her, "Where am I supposed to go?" And she didn't even look at me when she answered. My mom said, "That's not my problem anymore." My voice shook as I turned toward my stepfather standing by the doorway. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong." He looked away like I wasn't even worth answering. And then my little brother, just 10 years old, whispered, "Mom, don't." But she closed the door anyway. If this story reaches you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, not for me, but for every story of silence that deserves to be heard. And if this story truly resonates with you, leave a comment with the city or country you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I want to know how far this story travels. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and this is the night that changed everything in my family forever, even though I didn't understand it then. But before I tell you what happened that night, I need to take you back to the beginning of how I ended up standing in that hallway, holding a bag that weighed more than my entire childhood. It started hours earlier when I came home from school and noticed something was off. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her, her fingers tapping slowly like she was waiting for me. "Sit down," she said without looking up. I obeyed because that's what I always did. My life had always been built on obedience. She slid a piece of paper toward me and said, "This is going to happen tonight." I read it but didn't understand most of it. It had legal words, signatures, and my name written in places that made my stomach tighten. "What is this?" I asked. She finally looked at me then, and her eyes didn't feel like a mother's eyes anymore. "You're going to stay somewhere else for a while," she said carefully, "until things settle." I felt my throat tighten. "Did I do something wrong?" I asked again because I needed it to be something I could fix. My mother stood up, walked to the sink, and said, "You make everything harder than it needs to be. Emily." That was the moment I realized she wasn't sending me away because of something I did. She was sending me away because I existed in a way she no longer wanted to deal with. My stepfather finally spoke from behind her, not even looking at me. "Don't make this dramatic," he said. "It's already decided." I remember grabbing the edge of the table, my voice breaking as I said, "I can change. I'll be better. Just don't make me leave." My mother sighed like I was an inconvenience on her schedule. "You'll understand one day," she said, but she never explained anything. Not then, not ever. When night fell, she walked me to the door herself. The streetlight outside flickered like it was struggling to stay on. I asked her one last time, "Can I come back tomorrow?" She finally looked at me fully, and I saw something in her expression I still can't explain. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. "No," she said simply. And that was it. The door closed, the lock clicked, and my childhood ended right there on a cold porch step with nowhere to go. But what I didn't know then, what I only began to understand 20 years later, is that this wasn't just abandonment. It was something planned, something hidden, something that someone made sure I would never question, until the day a lawyer called my name and told me my entire past might not have been what I thought it was, and what he revealed next would make me question whether my mother ever truly sent me away at all. After that night, I did not become a child who cried anymore. I became a child who learned how to stay quiet. The first place I ended up was a temporary foster home on the edge of a small town in Illinois, a house that smelled like old wood and detergent that never fully cleaned anything. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Holloway, handed me a thin blanket and said, "We don't ask too many questions here, Emily. It is easier that way." I nodded because I had already learned that questions did not bring answers in my life. The first morning there, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. out of habit, waiting for my mother's voice that never came. Instead, I heard other children laughing in the hallway, loud and careless, like they had never been told they did not belong. At breakfast, I sat at the end of a long table with chipped plates and cold toast, and a boy across from me asked, "Why are you here?" I looked down and said, "I do not know." That was the first time I realized I had no story anyone had bothered to explain to me. Weeks turned into months, and I learned how to disappear in plain sight. At school, teachers would forget my name halfway through the year. At the foster home, I learned to fold my clothes perfectly so no one had a reason to comment on them. One afternoon, I received a letter from my mother. It was short, no apology, no explanation. Just 4 words, "Do not come back." I remember holding that paper for a long time, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed while the radiator clicked loudly in the background. Another girl in the home, Ashley, asked me, "Is that your mom?" I said yes. She frowned and said, "She does not sound like a mom." I did not answer her because I did not know what a real mother was supposed to sound like anymore. Years passed like that, one quiet survival after another. I worked small jobs when I turned 16, cleaning grocery store shelves after school, saving every dollar in a jar I hid under my mattress. No one in my family ever came looking for me. Not my mother, not my stepfather, not even my younger brother. I told myself maybe they forgot. Maybe it was easier that way. At 18, I aged out of foster care and moved into a small apartment with peeling paint and a heater that rattled at night. I worked during the day and studied at night, teaching myself everything I thought I would have learned if someone had stayed. I did not trust people easily. I did not call anyone family. I told myself I did not need it. But some nights, when the city was too quiet, I still wondered why a mother would look at her own child and decide she was something to erase. That question followed me into adulthood like a shadow I could not outrun. I built a life anyway, simple, controlled, predictable. I worked in administrative support, then moved into legal documentation assistance without ever fully understanding why the law fascinated me so much. Maybe it was because I spent my entire life feeling like something had been decided about me without my voice in the room. I learned to read contracts. I learned to notice what was missing between the lines. And slowly, I became very good at noticing what people tried to hide. I never expected my past to come back into my life. I thought it had been sealed behind time and distance. But one afternoon, everything shifted when I received an email that only contained a name, Linda Carter, my mother's name, and beneath it, a sentence that made my hands go cold. "There are unresolved legal discrepancies regarding your removal from guardianship." I stared at the screen for a long time without blinking. My first instinct was to close it and walk away. My second instinct was to read it again. And then I thought about that night when I was 12, standing on a porch with a backpack too heavy for a child, wondering why no one ever came back for me. I told myself I was done being that girl. But when I clicked reply and typed one sentence, I did not realize I was stepping back into a story I had spent 20 years trying to escape. And this time, someone finally wanted me to see what was hidden inside it. The email from Jonathan Blake stayed on my screen for 3 full days before I responded. Every time I opened it, my hand hovered over the keyboard like I was afraid the words might change if I waited too long. Finally, I wrote back, "What kind of legal discrepancies?" His reply came less than 2 hours later. "Your childhood guardianship removal does not align with standard court procedures. I need to meet you." That sentence alone should have meant nothing to me anymore. I had lived 20 years without answers, so silence should have been normal. But something in the way he wrote it felt like a door cracking open that had been sealed for a very long time. I agreed to meet him in downtown Chicago, in a small law office above a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and paper files. When I arrived, Jonathan Blake was already waiting, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a calm voice that did not try to convince me of anything. He slid a folder across the table and said, "Before you look at this, I need you to understand something. Your removal from your home at age 12 does not match the legal pattern of abandonment." I frowned and said, "My mother kicked me out. That is all I know." He opened the folder slowly. Inside were scanned documents, court stamps, and signatures. Then he pointed to a line and said, "This is the problem. The signature attributed to your mother appears after the custody transfer was already finalized. That should not be possible." I stared at it, my throat tightening. "Are you saying it was fake?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "I am saying something does not add up, and I have seen cases like this before when there is something being protected." I leaned back in the chair, trying to steady my breathing. "Protected from what?" I asked. Jonathan looked at me directly and said, "From you." The room felt smaller after that. I remember gripping the edge of the table as he continued explaining that there were financial records tied to my name from the same year I disappeared from the system. Trust accounts, legal holdings, references to an inheritance structure I had never been told about. "There is something here worth significant value," he said carefully, "and it appears to have been redirected shortly after your removal." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "My mother did not have money like that." He closed the folder slightly and said, "That is what makes this unusual." I felt like I was sitting inside a life that belonged to someone else. Every explanation I had carried for 20 years suddenly felt thin, unstable. I asked him, "Why would anyone erase a child from paperwork over money?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, "That is what we are trying to understand." When I left the office that day, the city felt different, like every building was hiding something I had never noticed before. I did not sleep that night. I kept replaying my mother's face, her voice saying I was no longer her problem, and for the first time I wondered if she had been repeating something she was told to say rather than something she chose. The next morning, Jonathan called me again. His voice was lower this time. "There is something else you need to see, but I cannot send it electronically. It is sensitive." I asked him where. He said, "Tomorrow. Bring your questions, because after this, things will not go back to how they were." I hung up and sat in silence for a long time, feeling something shift inside me that I could not yet name. Because whatever he was about to show me was not just about my past anymore. It felt like it was about to change everything I thought I knew about why I was taken away in the first place. The next morning, I met Jonathan Blake again, this time in a different office, quieter, almost too clean, like no one wanted any trace of emotion to stay inside it. He did not speak much when I arrived. Instead, he placed a second folder on the table and said, "I need you to prepare yourself before you read this." I asked, "For what exactly?" And he replied, "For the possibility that everything you believed about your mother is based on a story someone constructed for you." My fingers went cold as I opened it. Inside were phone records, bank transfers, and handwritten notes between names I did not recognize at first. But then I saw it. My mother's name, Linda Carter, appearing alongside a legal consultant and a financial advisor tied to a trust account that carried my name as a beneficiary. I looked up and said, "This does not make sense. We were poor. We were struggling. There was nothing like this." Jonathan leaned forward slightly and said, "That is what makes it important, because according to this, there was something worth protecting." I felt my chest tighten as I kept reading, payments redirected, documents amended, dates adjusted after signatures were already filed. And then one sentence in a memo stopped me completely. "Child relocation required to secure asset structure integrity." I whispered, "Child relocation?" Jonathan nodded slowly and said, "It appears your removal was not just emotional, it was procedural." I pushed the folder away and said, "No, my mother hated me. That is what happened. She threw me out." But even as I said it, I could hear how uncertain my voice sounded. Jonathan did not argue. He simply said, "Then why does she still control accounts linked to your identity after you disappeared?" That question hit harder than anything before. I thought about all the years I spent, believing I was unwanted, disposable, forgotten. And now I was being told I might have been removed for something far more calculated. My phone buzzed in my hand suddenly. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. A woman's voice came through, sharp and nervous. "Is this Emily Carter?" I said yes, and she paused before speaking again. "My name is Claire Benson. I used to work with your mother." My entire body went still. Jonathan watched me carefully as I asked, "What do you want?" Claire lowered her voice and said, "You need to stop asking questions about the Carter file. Some people are still watching it." I looked at Jonathan and mouthed, "Who is this?" But he did not know either. Claire continued, "Your mother did not act alone. She was instructed to do it. And if you keep digging, they will notice." I asked, "Who is they?" But the line went silent for half a second too long. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "People who made sure you were never supposed to exist in the system after age 12. The call ended abruptly. I sat frozen, phone still against my ear, feeling like the room had tilted slightly off balance. Jonathan reached for the folder and said quietly, "This is bigger than a custody case." I asked him, "Then what is it?" But he did not answer immediately. Instead, he slid one final document toward me. A signature page with my name partially redacted, and a second name repeated underneath every approval line. Not my mother's, someone else's. And as I stared at it, I realized something horrifying was beginning to form beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew. Because if my mother did not act alone, then the truth was not just hidden anymore. It was still active, still protected, and possibly still watching me right now. After I left Jonathan Blake's office that day, nothing in my life felt stable anymore. I kept expecting the world to slow down, to make sense again, but instead everything started to unravel in small, persistent ways. It began with a phone call I did not answer, then another, and another, unknown numbers at first, then numbers I slowly recognized as blocked contacts from the past. Finally, one evening, I saw a name flash on my screen, Linda Carter, my mother. I stared at it for a full minute before it stopped ringing. A voicemail followed immediately. I did not play it right away. When I finally did, her voice was different from what I remembered, less controlled. More fragile. Emily, she said, please call me back. We need to talk about what you have been told. There was a long pause. Then she added, you do not understand the situation you are getting into. I sat on my couch in silence, replaying that message twice, then a third time. For 20 years, I had not heard her voice ask for anything from me. Now suddenly she needed me to understand something. I did not respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and saw an email waiting from her. Subject line, stop digging into the past. Inside, it was short. You are reopening something that was closed for a reason. Let it go, Emily. You do not know who else is involved. My hands went still on the keyboard. I whispered, who else? But there was no reply. The next day, Jonathan called me again. Did she contact you? He asked immediately. I said yes and read him the email. He went quiet for a moment before saying, that is not a personal request. That is a warning. I asked him, from who? And he answered, that is what I am trying to find out. Over the following week, the attempts became more frequent. Letters arrived at my apartment mailbox, all formal, all carefully worded, asking me to cease communication regarding any historical guardianship inquiry tied to my name. One letter included a return address from a law firm I had never heard of. Another came without any sender information at all, only a printed message. This matter was resolved 20 years ago. Further inquiry may result in legal consequences. I showed everything to Jonathan. He studied the documents and said, someone is actively trying to contain this information. I asked him, why would they care about me now after all this time? He looked at me and said, because you are asking the wrong questions at the right time. Then came the call I did not expect. My stepfather. I had not heard his voice in 2 decades either. When I answered, there was silence for a few seconds before he spoke. Emily, he said slowly, you need to stop this. Your mother is not the only one involved. My grip tightened on the phone. Then who is? I asked. He hesitated, then said, people who made decisions that you were never supposed to question. I asked him directly, was I taken for money? He exhaled sharply and said, do not ask me that. And then the line went dead. After that, everything stopped for a brief moment. No calls, no emails, no letters, just silence. At first, I thought it meant I had reached the end of whatever this was. But instead, it felt like something was preparing. Jonathan warned me, silence is not peace in cases like this. It is coordination. I did not fully understand what he meant until I realized something important. All the people reaching out before had one thing in common. They were reacting. Now, no one was. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, staring at my phone placed face down on the table. I felt like I was suspended outside of my own life, waiting for something I could not name to arrive. And in that silence, I understood the most unsettling part of all this so far. The past was no longer chasing me. It had stopped running, and now it was deciding what to do next. The silence did not last long. It only felt like it did because I was waiting for it to break. When it finally did, it was not dramatic. It was a single phone call at 3:14 a.m. that lit up my apartment in a cold blue glow. Unknown number again. I answered instinctively, my voice already tired before I spoke. Hello? There was static, then a woman's voice I did not recognize at first. Is this Emily Carter? She asked softly. I said yes, and she paused like she was deciding whether to continue. "My name is Dr. Helen Morris," she said. "I worked in social services 20 years ago. I handled part of your case." I sat up slowly, my heart tightening. "What case?" I asked, even though I already knew. She lowered her voice further. "Your removal. There are things you were never told." I pressed my fingers against my forehead. "Why are you calling me now?" I asked. There was a long silence before she said, "Because someone reopened your file, and I do not think they understand what it could expose." My throat went dry. "Expose what?" I whispered. But she did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "Your mother was not the only signature on those documents." And then the line went dead. I sat there for a long time holding the phone, unable to move. The apartment felt colder than before, like the walls had absorbed the conversation and were now holding it against me. The next morning I went to work, but I barely remember the day. I remember my coworker Daniel asking, "You look like you did not sleep. Are you okay?" I forced a small smile and said, "Just tired." He frowned and said, "You have been saying that a lot lately." I did not respond. Later that week, I received a small envelope delivered by courier. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It was old, slightly faded, showing a courthouse steps scene. My mother stood there, younger, holding papers. Next to her was a man I did not recognize, his face partially turned away. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note read, "She did not act alone." I dropped the photo on my desk like it burned my fingers. Jonathan called me minutes later as if he already knew. "Did you receive it?" he asked. I said yes. He sighed quietly and said, "We are getting closer, but that means you are also getting closer to whoever has been watching this for 2 decades. I asked, "Watching me?" And he replied, "Not just watching, managing." That word stayed with me longer than anything else. Managing. Like my life had been something controlled from a distance. That night, I tried to sleep but kept waking up every hour. At 2:47 a.m., my phone lit up again. This time, it was a blocked number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. A man's voice came through, calm and precise. "Stop contacting anyone about Linda Carter," he said. I sat up immediately. "Who is this?" I asked. He replied, "Someone who is giving you one final chance to leave this alone." I felt my hands tremble slightly. "Or what?" I asked. There was a short pause before he said, "Or you will find out why you were removed so quickly and why no one ever came back for you." Then the line disconnected. I stayed awake until sunrise, sitting in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was the only thing still functioning normally in my life. For the first time, I stopped trying to reach back into the past. I stopped calling Jonathan. I stopped checking emails. I stopped responding. I simply sat in silence and let everything go still. It did not feel like peace. It felt like emptiness expanding outward. And in that emptiness, I realized something I had not allowed myself to feel before. I was completely alone in this. No family, no certainty, no protection. Only questions that were starting to feel heavier than answers. But as the morning light slowly filled the room, I noticed something different inside me. The silence no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the moment, right before something finally begins to move again. After that night of silence, something inside me stopped waiting for permission to continue. I woke up early, not because I could sleep, but because I no longer wanted to lie still in a life that felt suspended. The city outside my window looked the same, but I did not. I arrived at work that morning earlier than anyone else, coffee in hand, hair still damp, and for the first time I did not feel like I was hiding. My coworker Daniel looked up from his desk and said, "You have been doing this every day lately. What changed?" I paused for a second, then replied, "I think I stopped waiting for things to go back to normal." He studied me for a moment and said, "That sounds dangerous." I smiled slightly and said, "Or necessary." That week, I started noticing things I had always ignored. Small inconsistencies in legal documents, missing signatures in archived files, patterns that did not align with standard procedures. I stayed late at the office one evening, reviewing a stack of case files, when my supervisor walked by and said, "You are still here?" I nodded without looking up. He added, "You do not have to overwork yourself, Emily." I finally looked at him and said, "I am not overworking. I am paying attention." He did not respond, just walked away slowly, like he was unsure what to make of me. A few days later, I was called into a meeting I did not expect. A woman from a regional legal oversight office introduced herself and said, "We have been reviewing your documentation analysis on the Carter Archive." I asked, "My analysis?" She nodded and said, "Your notes on procedural inconsistencies were forwarded to us. They are more detailed than what our internal review team produced." I did not know who had sent them, but I had a guess. Later that night, I received a short message from Jonathan Blake. "You are being noticed now. Be careful how far you look." I read it twice, then closed my phone. For the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt direction. I began spending weekends researching archived guardianship records, tracing patterns in redacted files, building timelines from fragments most people would ignore. I stopped telling anyone what I was doing, not because I was hiding, but because I had learned that silence was sometimes the only place where truth could grow without interference. One afternoon, Daniel caught me reviewing scanned documents at my desk and said, "You are not just organizing files anymore, are you?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "I do not think I ever was." He leaned back and said, "You realize this is how people end up in situations they cannot step back from." I replied, "Maybe I am already past that point." He did not argue. Instead, he said quietly, "Then at least make sure it leads somewhere worth it." That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. A week later, I was offered a temporary contract position with a private legal research group that specialized in historical case reconstruction. They had reviewed my independent work and wanted someone who could connect structural inconsistencies across legacy records. When I walked into their office for the first time, the lead analyst looked at me and said, "We were told you have a different way of seeing patterns." I simply replied, "I notice what is missing." That became my work. Not searching for answers, but mapping absences. Days blurred into focused hours, documents turning into structures of meaning I could finally understand. I stopped feeling like someone being pulled backward and started feeling like someone building forward. One evening, as I left the office, Daniel messaged me, "You are not the same person who walked in here a few months ago." I looked at the message for a long moment before replying, "I think I am finally becoming the version of myself I was supposed to be before everything was taken away." He responded, "Or before you were forced to survive without it." I did not answer after that. Instead, I stood outside in the cool air, watching the city move around me, and for the first time I did not feel invisible inside it. Somewhere in the distance, opportunities I could not yet see were beginning to align quietly, like pieces of a larger structure finally finding their place. And I knew, without being able to explain how, that whatever was coming next was not going to be small. The first morning I walked into the new office, I felt something I had never felt before in my life. Recognition. Not of my past, but of my capability. The building was quiet, modern, all glass walls and soft lighting, the kind of place where every step sounded intentional. On the reception desk, a new badge was waiting for me. It read, "Emily Carter, Senior Legal Research Analyst." I stared at it for a moment longer than I expected. It was just plastic, just ink, but it felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. When I clipped it onto my blazer, something inside me shifted, like a version of me that had been waiting for permission finally stepped forward. My manager, Rebecca Lane, met me in the hallway and said, "We reviewed your previous analysis again. You are not just good at this, you are essential to the project." I nodded, unsure how to respond to praise that did not feel conditional. She added, "You are being moved to the Carter Historical Review Division permanently." The name hit me quietly. Carter. My name. My past. I said, "That was fast." She replied, "Not fast, necessary." My workspace was different now. Dual monitors, secured archives access, and a private clearance code that allowed me to view files most people never even knew existed. On my desk, there was a printed folder labeled Restricted Timeline Mapping Unit. I opened it slowly, and inside were the same patterns I had been tracing for months, but now aligned into a system that others were finally willing to see. My coworker Daniel walked in later that afternoon holding 2 cups of coffee and said, "I heard they promoted you." I took the coffee and said, "It is not really a promotion. It is more like they stopped ignoring what I was already doing." He smiled slightly and said, "That sounds like you." I looked at the screen in front of me, rows of structured data forming connections I had once only seen alone, and said, "For the first time, I do not feel like I am guessing anymore." Over the following weeks, I was brought into meetings I had never been invited to before. Legal teams, compliance officers, data reconstruction specialists. They listened when I spoke. Not politely, seriously. During one meeting, a senior analyst pointed to my report and said, "This correlation between custody redactions and financial restructuring is something we missed for years." I answered, "It was not missing. It was fragmented." He nodded and said, "Then put it back together." And I did. Each day, I stayed later, not out of obligation, but because I could finally see structure where there had once been chaos. One evening, Rebecca handed me a revised access card. It had a different designation now. Lead Investigator Legacy Systems Analysis. She said, "You are no longer supporting the case, you are leading it." I ran my fingers over the card before clipping it on. It was not just a title. It was proof that I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I could now uncover. As I left the building that night, Daniel caught up with me at the elevator and said, "You realize people are starting to talk about your work?" I asked, "In a good way or a dangerous way?" He hesitated and said, "Both usually mean the same thing here." I looked at him and replied, "Then I guess I am finally in the right place." The elevator doors closed slowly between us, and as I stood alone inside, I realized something simple but powerful. The version of me who had once stood outside a locked door at 12 years old was no longer waiting for answers. She was the one building them. And as the elevator descended toward the street level, I knew that the present moment was no longer just survival or discovery. It was momentum, pulling me directly back toward the truth I had spent my entire life orbiting without ever reaching. The morning everything began to converge. I did not feel fear at first. I felt something quieter, like the air before a storm finally decides to break. I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, adjusting my blazer, and for a moment I did not recognize the woman looking back at me, not because she was different, but because she was no longer waiting. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Rebecca Lane. "You are needed at the Downtown Federal Archive facility today. Priority review session." No explanation, just coordinates and a time. When I arrived, the building felt colder than usual, almost sterile in a way that made conversation sound quieter than it should. Daniel was already there waiting near the entrance, holding a folder against his chest. He looked at me and said, "You are early." I replied, "I did not want to be late for something I do not understand yet." He gave a small nod and said, "You are not the only one who feels that way today." Inside, the conference room was already filling with people I had only seen in emails and encrypted documents. Legal analysts, compliance supervisors, federal consultants. The kind of room where nothing casual ever happened. Rebecca stood at the front and said, "We are opening the final review phase of the Carter Legacy file." My name was not spoken directly, but I felt it in the air anyway. She continued, "This is the stage where inconsistencies either resolve or collapse into verified findings." I sat down, placing my notes in front of me, and noticed my hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else. A man across the table leaned slightly toward me and asked, "You are Carter Analysis Lead, correct?" I nodded and said, "For now." He studied me for a moment and replied, "We have reviewed your reconstruction mapping. It is unusually precise for independent work." I answered, "It is not independent anymore." The room shifted slightly after that. Screens lit up with synchronized records, timelines, and cross-reference documents that I had spent months building piece by piece. Now they were being projected for everyone to see. Daniel whispered beside me, "This is the closest we have ever been to the full structure." I said quietly, "Then we are still missing something." Rebecca heard me and turned. "Explain," she said. I hesitated only a moment before responding. "There are still gaps in the guardianship transition sequence. Someone corrected the timeline after the fact, but not cleanly." A silence followed. Then she said, "Show us." I stood up and walked to the screen, pointing at a section most people had overlooked. "Here," I said, "the signature sequence is not just misaligned, it is overwritten, twice." One of the analysts frowned and said, "That would require access after legal sealing." I nodded and replied, "Exactly." The room went quiet again. Rebecca stepped closer and said, "Are you suggesting internal authorization?" I looked at the data, then said, I am suggesting someone with authority ensured this was never meant to be questioned. A subtle shift moved through the room after that. No one spoke immediately. Even the air felt heavier. Daniel leaned in slightly and whispered, "You are about to trigger something bigger than this room." I did not answer him, because at that exact moment, my screen refreshed automatically. A new file had appeared in the system. No sender, no label, just a single line of text. Final authorization record attached. Rebecca saw it at the same time I did and said quietly, "That file was not supposed to be accessible yet." I moved the cursor toward it, feeling every second stretch longer than the last. The room behind me fell into complete silence. And just as I clicked to open it, the screen began to load the first page of something none of us were prepared to see. The moment I clicked open the final authorization record, the entire room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. The screen did not load quickly. It unfolded slowly, line by line, as if the system itself was hesitant to reveal what had been buried for decades. I stood at the front of the conference room, my hands still on the mouse, while behind me no one spoke. Even the sound of shifting chairs stopped completely. Rebecca Lane stepped closer and said quietly, "Emily, step away from the terminal." I did not move. The first page finished loading, and I read the header out loud without thinking. Final custodial authorization record, Carter Minor transition case. A man from the federal oversight team frowned and said, "That file should not exist in this directory." Daniel leaned forward and whispered, "This is beyond procedural review now." I scrolled down slowly, my voice steady as I read each section. Authorized by State Oversight Legal Consortium. Co-signed by. I paused for half a second because I recognized one of the names. It was not my mother. It was someone from within the system we had been reviewing for weeks. Rebecca's expression changed slightly and she said, "That name should have been redacted." I looked at her and said, "Then someone restored it." The room shifted again, tension tightening like something unseen had just moved closer. I continued reading, and the next line made the air feel heavier. Primary Guardian Directive executed under Non-Disclosure Custody Restructuring Protocol. A legal consultant across the table said, "That protocol is only used in asset protection cases involving protected estates." I turned slightly and said, "Then explain why a 12-year-old child was classified under asset protection." No one answered immediately. Then Daniel spoke softly, almost to himself. "Emily, this was never just a family case." Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors opened. The sound was quiet, almost polite, but it changed everything instantly. I turned around slowly, and I saw her. My mother, Linda Carter, standing in the doorway like she had been there all along, just waiting for the moment she was allowed to enter. She did not look like a memory. She looked like someone who had prepared for this moment. Her eyes moved across the room, past the analysts, past the screens, until they landed on me. For a second, no one spoke. Then she said my name. Emily. Not loudly, not emotionally, just factually, like she was confirming something she had already accepted. I stepped away from the screen and said, "You are not supposed to be part of this system access." Her expression did not change. She replied, "Neither were you." A silence followed that felt heavier than anything before it. I took one step forward and said, "Explain why my childhood file is tied to financial restructuring and legal consortium approval." One of the federal consultants immediately stood up and said, "Wait, you are the subject of this file?" Another analyst whispered, "She is the lead investigator." My mother finally looked away from me and toward the screen. "So this is what you became," she said quietly. I replied, "No, this is what I became after I was removed from everything I was supposed to be." Her voice lowered slightly. "You were not removed without reason." I responded calmly. "Then give me the reason in a way that does not collapse under its own documentation." For the first time, her expression shifted slightly. Not guilt, not sadness, something closer to pressure. Behind her, another figure stepped into the doorway. A senior legal authority I had only seen referenced in the files. He looked at the room, then at me, and said, "We did not expect you to reach this level of access." I asked him, "Then what did you expect?" He hesitated and said, "That you would never become the one reviewing it." The room remained silent. Rebecca looked between all of us and said softly, "Emily, step away from the case file. But I did not. Because at that moment, I realized something none of them had accounted for. I was not just reading my past anymore. I was standing inside the system that had defined it. My mother took one step forward and said quietly, "You do not understand what you are opening." I looked at her and replied, "Then start explaining." She opened her mouth to speak, but before any answer came out, the final line of the authorization record refreshed on the screen by itself, updating in real time, and every name in the room suddenly changed status from witness to subject review pending. The moment the system updated the final authorization record, the room did not explode into chaos. Instead, it collapsed into silence, so complete it felt artificial. Every screen across the conference table now displayed the same status change. Subject review pending. Rebecca Lane stepped back slightly and said, "This is not possible. We are reviewers, not subjects." Daniel looked at me and whispered, "Emily, something just flipped the entire structure." I did not move. I kept my eyes on the screen where my name, my mother's name, and several unfamiliar authority signatures were now interconnected in a single active case chain. Then I turned slowly toward the room and said calmly, "So now I am not just analyzing the file. I am inside it." My mother, Linda Carter, stood near the doorway, her posture controlled but no longer confident. She spoke first, her voice measured. "Emily, this is not how you were meant to see this," I replied. "Then how was I meant to see it? As a child with no explanation? Or as an adult who never asks questions?" A federal consultant stepped forward and said, "We need to pause this session immediately." Rebecca responded quickly, "We cannot pause a live authorization cascade. It is already propagated." I asked quietly, "Propagated to where?" No one answered. Instead, a second alert appeared on the screen. "External oversight notification sent." Daniel exhaled and said, "That means this is now above our clearance level." My mother finally walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from me. For the first time, her voice softened slightly. "You should not have been exposed to this layer." I looked at her and said, "I was exposed to it at 12 years old, when you told me I was no longer your responsibility." A small silence followed. Then she said, "You do not understand what was required to protect what came after you were removed." I responded, "Then explain it without hiding behind procedures and signatures." Her jaw tightened, and she glanced briefly at the screen before saying, "There are things tied to your identity that extend beyond family structure." I said, "Like what?" She hesitated for the first time. Behind her, one of the legal authorities stepped closer and said, "This is no longer a personal matter. It never was." I turned toward him and asked, "Then why did it feel like I was the only one living the consequences?" No response came. Instead, the system screen refreshed again, and a new classification appeared. Primary origin subject confirmed. Rebecca looked at it and said, "That designation should not exist in civilian records." Daniel whispered, "Emily, this is escalating beyond legal review." I took a slow breath and said, "Everything about my life has been classified as something I was never allowed to understand." My mother finally spoke again, her voice lower now. "If you continue, you will not be able to go back to how you live now." I looked directly at her and said, "I have not been able to go back since the night you closed the door." That statement landed in the room like a weight no one wanted to carry. For a moment, no one spoke at all. Then Rebecca quietly said, "We need containment protocol discussion." But before anyone could respond, another update appeared on every screen simultaneously. Subject linkage verification complete. All related custodial decisions now under full audit review. Daniel stepped closer to me and said, "Emily, this means every decision tied to your removal is now being reevaluated in real time." I nodded slowly and said, "Then the truth is no longer something hidden in files." I looked at my mother again, and this time my voice stayed completely steady. "It is already coming out." She did not respond immediately. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not about the system, but about me. The legal authority behind her said quietly, "This level of exposure will affect everyone connected to the original authorization chain." I asked, "Including you?" He did not answer. The room felt tighter now, as if every person inside it understood they were no longer observers. They were part of the structure being examined. Rebecca finally said, "We need to move this to closed review immediately." But the system did not allow it. The screen displayed a final line that none of us had seen before. Audit initiated from subject-level access point. And in that moment, I understood something none of them had expected. I was no longer being brought into the truth. I was the one triggering its release. But what I did not yet realize, as every face in the room turned toward me with growing uncertainty, was that the next record to appear would not just explain what happened to me, it would decide who was responsible for it. After the system audit was triggered, and every record in the room began to shift under real-time review, something unexpected happened. No alarms sounded, no authority intervened. Instead, the screen slowly began to stabilize, as if the structure itself was deciding what could remain and what could not. One by one, names began to separate from the chain of custody records. Connections that had defined my entire life started to dissolve quietly, replaced by updated classifications and corrected timelines. My mother stood a few feet away, no longer speaking, no longer trying to control the direction of the room. For the first time, she looked like someone waiting for a verdict she could not influence. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel confusion either. What I felt was distance, not from her but from the version of myself who once needed her answers to survive. Rebecca Lane finally broke the silence and said, "The audit has completed its initial restructuring phase. Several custodial entries have been invalidated." Daniel looked at me and said quietly, "Emily, your file is no longer what it used to be." I stepped closer to the screen and saw it clearly. The designation that had defined my entire life was gone, not erased, corrected. Rewritten into something that no longer framed me as a removed subject, but as an independent record with no enforced guardianship link. My voice came out steady when I said, "So it was never about me being erased, it was about keeping something aligned." A federal consultant replied, "It appears that multiple systems were synchronized around your removal event. That synchronization has now failed." My mother finally spoke, her voice lower than before. "You were not supposed to reach this level of access." I turned to her and said, "I did not reach it. I followed the inconsistencies you left behind." She did not answer. For the first time, there was nothing left in her words that could shape my understanding of what happened. The legal authority who had arrived earlier closed his folder slowly and said, "This case will now transition into historical correction status." I asked, "What does that mean for me?" Rebecca looked at me and answered honestly, "It means your past will no longer be treated as a closed story." The room began to empty slowly after that. One by one, analysts left, systems were logged out, and voices that had filled the space with urgency disappeared into distance. Daniel stayed behind for a moment and said, "What are you going to do now?" I looked at the empty screen, where my life had been rewritten line by line, and replied, "I am going to live without waiting for permission to understand it." He nodded once, like he understood that answer more than he needed to explain it. When I finally left the building, the air outside felt different, not because the world had changed, but because I had. There was no dramatic closure waiting for me, no final confrontation, no perfect resolution. Instead, there was space that no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions as chains. Weeks later, I no longer worked in silence or in search of fragments. I worked in clarity, not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer feared what I might find. My mother and I never returned to what we once were. Some truths do not rebuild relationships. They redefine them. And I learned that peace is not the absence of history. It is the ability to stand inside it without being trapped by it. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it is that identity is not something given to you by the people who raise you or the systems that record you. It is something you reclaim every time you refuse to let silence decide your value. So if you are listening to this, and you have ever felt forgotten, replaced, or rewritten by someone else's choices, I want you to remember this. You are not the version of yourself that someone else tried to leave behind. You are the continuation of every moment you chose to keep going anyway. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the core truth I want to leave with you is this. No one has the right to define your existence without your voice in the story. And to you who stayed until the end, thank you. Not just for listening, but for understanding. If this story found a place in you, let it stay there gently. Share it with someone who needs it. Leave your thoughts below if you feel called to. And if you want to continue walking through stories like this, there are more waiting in the playlist, each one carrying another truth, another silence, another moment of becoming. Sometimes the stories we think are over are only the beginning of the ones that finally set us free.